The morning sun had just begun to warm the quiet street when a small white car pulled into the driveway of an old two-story house. The paint on the walls had faded to a soft gray, and ivy crept up one side like nature's slow handwriting. The for sale sign looked new and clean, standing out against the weathered porch. A light breeze moved it slightly, making it squeak with each swing. It was the kind of house that held more than just walls and windows. It held time, memories, and stories. The woman who lived there was 97 years old. She had owned the home for more than 70 years. Her husband had passed away long ago, and her children had grown, moved to other cities, and started their own families. She now lived there alone with only her cat for company. Her neighbors saw her sometimes sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world outside with calm eyes that seemed to know more than they ever would. She had decided to sell the house after months of gentle convincing from her family. They told her it was too big, too old, and too quiet. She had smiled at them, nodding softly. But inside she knew it wasn't easy. It was the only home she had ever really known as an adult. Every room held a piece of her life. Every corner whispered names and laughter from years long gone. When she called the real estate office to list her property, the receptionist had been polite and a little surprised to hear the age in her voice. The woman spoke slowly but clearly, asking to meet someone who could handle everything for her because she was not strong enough to do much on her own. The company sent 2 agents, both experienced and kind, who had worked together for years. They had seen many old homes before, but none quite like this one. As they stepped out of the car that morning, one of them adjusted his jacket and looked at the house. "Looks like it hasn't been touched in decades," he said quietly. His partner nodded, taking in the sight of the tall trees, the cracked path, and the lace curtains behind the glass. The air smelled faintly of earth and old roses. They walked up the porch steps, which creaked under their weight, and rang the doorbell. It chimed weakly as if the sound had grown tired with age. A moment later, the door opened just enough for them to see a thin, elderly woman with silver hair neatly pinned back. She smiled, and the lines on her face deepened like a soft map of a long, full life. "Good morning," she said kindly. "You must be the agents." They greeted her warmly, introducing themselves. She stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. The moment they crossed the threshold, the scent of lavender and old wood filled the air. The hallway was dimly lit, with sunlight slipping through patterned curtains. The floorboards gleamed with polish even though they looked worn from years of footsteps. "Please make yourselves comfortable," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I haven't had visitors in a long while." They followed her into the living room. It was like stepping into another time. The furniture was old but well kept. A large wooden cabinet stood against one wall, filled with porcelain figurines and framed photographs. A clock ticked softly above the fireplace. The wallpaper, though faded, had a gentle floral pattern that must have been popular decades ago. There were stacks of neatly folded blankets, embroidered cushions, and books that looked as though they had been read many times. The agents took out their notebooks and began asking her questions about the property size, when it was built, and any recent repairs. She answered politely, but with short, careful words, as though her thoughts were somewhere else. As they talked, one of the agents couldn't help but glance around the room. Everything was spotless, but there was something different about it, not just old-fashioned, but almost untouched. It was as if time had slowed down inside these walls. Nothing seemed out of place, yet there was a strange feeling in the air, something hard to describe. When they asked if they could look around the house, the woman nodded. "Of course," she said. "Please take your time. I'll just sit here and rest for a while." The agents began their tour. They started with the kitchen, which had appliances so old they looked like museum pieces. The walls were covered with faded photographs, family gatherings, birthdays, picnics. In one photo, a young couple smiled proudly, holding a newborn baby. In another, the same couple stood in front of the house newly built with the garden just planted. They realized the woman they had just spoken to was the same person in those pictures, only much younger, her eyes full of light and hope. They moved into the dining room next. The long wooden table was perfectly set, as though waiting for guests who would never arrive. There was a faint smell of lemon polish and something else, maybe baked bread or cinnamon, a scent that had somehow stayed behind from years of Sunday dinners. Everywhere they looked, there was history. The agent spoke in whispers as if afraid to disturb the silence. One of them ran a finger along the edge of a picture frame and noticed it had been recently dusted. Everything, though ancient, was lovingly cared for. When they climbed the stairs, the steps creaked softly. The hallway upstairs was narrow, with doors on both sides. They opened the first door and found a bedroom with a neatly made bed covered in a quilt of many colors. The quilt looked handmade, with tiny, careful stitches. On the dresser sat a jewelry box and a small mirror, and beside it an old black and white photo of a man in uniform. His smile was gentle, his eyes steady. "That must be her husband," one of them whispered. The other nodded. They both felt a quiet respect. The second room was smaller, clearly a child's room. Though it hadn't been used in years, it still carried a soft energy. There were shelves full of toys, wooden cars, dolls with porcelain faces, a small rocking horse. The curtains had little stars printed on them. The agents paused for a long moment. It was as if they could almost hear laughter echoing from decades ago. When they reached the last room, something caught their attention. The door was slightly ajar, but the inside was dark. They pushed it open gently. The air felt cooler there. It was a study or maybe a personal office. The shelves were full of books, some old and worn, others newer. A desk stood near the window, covered in papers, letters, and a typewriter. One of the agents noticed a small box on the table. It was made of wood and had a tiny brass lock, though it wasn't locked. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were old photographs, letters tied with ribbon, and a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read something about a local family who had lived through a fire many decades ago. The woman's last name was mentioned. It seemed she had survived something tragic back in the 1940s. He carefully closed the box and placed it back. He didn't say anything to his partner. Some stories, he thought, deserved to stay private. They went back downstairs to find the woman sitting quietly on her armchair. Her cat curled on her lap. She looked peaceful, her hands resting gently on the animal's fur. The light from the window fell softly across her face, showing the faint smile she wore. "Did you see everything you needed to?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," one of them replied. "Your home is beautiful. It's rare to see something so well kept." "Thank you," she said, almost whispering. "This house has been good to me. It's been my whole life." There was silence for a few moments. Even the clock seemed to tick slower. One of the agents asked if she had any preference for who might buy the house. She looked thoughtful. "Someone who will love it," she said simply. "That's all that matters. It needs someone who can care for it now. I've done my part." They promised to do their best, then discussed some details about the listing. She listened patiently, nodding at the right times, but her gaze often drifted toward the window, where the sunlight shimmered on the garden outside. The roses there were in full bloom, their colors bright against the dull gray fence. It was clear she had tended to them for years. Before they left, she asked if they wanted some tea. They politely declined, though they felt guilty doing so. She smiled anyway, as if she had expected that answer. As they walked toward the door, one of them noticed something. A small painting hung near the hallway. It showed the same house, but in its early days, surrounded by open land and a wide blue sky. It had been painted with care, maybe by someone who had loved the place deeply. "She painted that," the woman said softly when she saw them looking. "When we first moved in, everything felt new. I wanted to remember it that way forever." They smiled and thanked her for her time. She walked them to the door, her steps slow but steady. As they turned to leave, she said something that stayed with them. "People think a house is just a place to live," she said. "But sometimes it holds your heart for you long after you've forgotten where you left it." The words were gentle but carried weight. The agents didn't know what to say. They simply nodded and walked back to their car. As they looked back, she was still standing on the porch, one hand raised in a small wave. They drove off in silence for a while, both lost in thought. They had seen many houses in their careers, luxurious mansions, modern apartments, cozy cottages, but none had felt quite like this one. There was something almost sacred about it, a sense that it had witnessed more life, love, and loss than they could ever imagine. Neither of them knew it yet, but what they would soon discover inside that old house, hidden behind its quiet walls, would leave them speechless. There was more to it than just nostalgia. There was something waiting to be found, something that had been carefully kept safe for nearly a century, and that discovery would change everything. A few days after their first visit, the two agents returned to the old woman's house to take photographs and measure the rooms. The day was cool and clear. and the house looked even older in the bright morning light. Dew sparkled on the grass and a soft mist lingered around the garden fence. The for sale sign still stood quietly at the front, slightly tilted as if even it was reluctant to move forward. They parked on the street and sat for a moment before getting out. Neither said anything at first. The air carried a quiet weight that made them both uneasy, though they couldn't say why. It wasn't fear, just a feeling that this place deserved to be entered with care. When they knocked, the door opened slowly. The old woman greeted them with her gentle smile, wearing the same soft blue cardigan as before. Her eyes were bright, though her movements were slower this time. She seemed happy to see them. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I wasn't sure you'd come back so soon." "We wanted to start early," one of them said kindly. "There's good light today. Perfect for pictures." "Ah, yes," she said, nodding. "Good light makes everything look alive again." She let them in, then disappeared into the kitchen to prepare tea, even though they had told her it wasn't necessary. They could hear her slow movements, the soft clinking of cups and the sound of running water. It was clear that small acts like this still gave her joy. The agents unpacked their equipment. One carried a camera and tripod, while the other held a clipboard with floor plans. They moved quietly from room to room, capturing each corner, each detail. The wooden staircase, the antique furniture, the sunlight falling through lace curtains. The camera clicks echoed softly through the hallways. The house felt still but not empty. It carried a kind of warmth as though it was quietly watching them. Every photo they took seemed to hold more emotion than they expected. The faded wallpaper, the old books, even the way dust floated in the air, it all told a story. When they finished photographing the downstairs, they went up to the second floor. The old woman had said she would wait in the living room, so they were alone now. The air upstairs felt slightly cooler. They took more pictures, the bedrooms, the hallway, and finally the study they had seen before. Something about that room still felt different. The agent with the camera hesitated at the doorway. He looked around. The wooden box he had opened during their first visit was still there on the desk in the same spot. The sunlight through the small window made the brass latch gleam faintly. He stepped closer, drawn by curiosity he couldn't quite explain. He knew it wasn't right to open someone's things, but part of him felt like the box wanted to be seen again. He glanced at his partner, who was busy noting measurements near the bookshelf. Then slowly, he lifted the lid once more. Inside, everything was as before, the letters tied with ribbon, the faded newspaper clipping, the old photographs. But this time he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small envelope tucked beneath the stack of letters. It was pale yellow, the edges worn with age and sealed with wax that had cracked over time. There was a name written on the front in neat, looping handwriting. It wasn't the old woman's name. It was someone else's. He stared at it for a moment, then gently placed it back. Something about it didn't feel ordinary. He couldn't explain why, but he felt that letter held a story too heavy to touch. He closed the box and took a deep breath before turning back to his partner. "Everything okay?" the other asked. "Yeah," he said quickly, just checking the light. They finished upstairs and came back down to find the woman setting out tea and small cookies on the coffee table. She smiled when she saw them. "You've worked hard," she said softly. "Please sit for a moment. It's nice to have company." They thanked her and sat. The tea was warm and sweet, and for a few minutes they simply talked. She told them about the house, how she and her husband had built it right after the war, how they planted the garden together, how the oak tree in the yard had started as a sapling her father gave her. She spoke slowly, her voice gentle but strong, and her eyes often wandered toward the window, as if she was looking at memories only she could see. "Did you ever think of leaving?" one of them asked. "Never," she said softly. "This place, it kept me safe, even when life didn't." She didn't say more, and they didn't press. Some silences feel too sacred to break. When they left that day, they promised to bring her the listing papers by the end of the week. She thanked them with a smile and waved from the porch until they drove out of sight. But the image of that house, and the mysterious letter, stayed in their minds long after. Later that night, as they reviewed the photos in their office, one of them noticed something strange. In one of the shots taken in the upstairs study, the old wooden box was slightly open, though he was sure he had closed it. He zoomed in on the image. It wasn't just open. There was a piece of paper sticking out as if it had shifted on its own. He frowned, feeling uneasy. "You see that?" he asked his partner, pointing to the screen. His partner leaned closer. "That's odd," he murmured. "Maybe a breeze?" "Windows were closed," the other said quietly. They sat in silence, both staring at the screen. The photo gave them an odd feeling, not fear exactly, but something close to awe. It was as if the house itself was trying to say something. The next day they went back again, this time with a small maintenance crew to check the structure and plumbing. The old woman welcomed them once more, though she seemed a little tired. She stayed downstairs while the workers inspected the rooms. The agents moved around with clipboards, noting details, marking repairs. Everything was routine, until one of the workers called out from the basement, "There's something you should see down here." They followed him down the narrow steps. The basement smelled faintly of damp stone and old wood. It was darker than the rest of the house, with a single bulb casting a weak yellow glow. The walls were lined with shelves full of jars, old tools, and boxes labeled in fading handwriting. "What did you find?" one of them asked. The worker pointed to a section of the wall where the paint had peeled away. Behind the wall, just barely visible, was a small wooden panel that didn't match the rest. It looked newer, as if it had been replaced or added later. "Looks like someone patched this up years ago," the worker said. "But why would they do that?" "It's solid behind here." One of the agents touched the panel. It sounded hollow. "Maybe storage?" he guessed. "Could be," the worker said, tapping it. "You want me to check?" The agent hesitated. He didn't want to disturb anything without permission, but curiosity won again. "Let's take a quick look," he said. "Careful, though." The worker used a small tool to pry at the edge of the panel. It came loose with a soft creak. Behind it was a narrow cavity between the walls. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a small tin box. Dust covered it thickly, and when the worker handed it over, it felt heavier than expected. They carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The old woman looked surprised when she saw it. "Oh," she said softly. Her hand trembled slightly. "You found it. You know what it is?" one of the agents asked gently. She nodded, her eyes moist. "Yes, I thought it was lost a long time ago." She reached out and carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a collection of small items. A few coins, a locket, a faded photo, and a folded letter tied with ribbon. She touched each one as if greeting an old friend. "This was my husband's," she whispered. "He hid it there during the war. He said he wanted to keep a piece of our life safe in case we lost everything." The room was quiet. The agents watched in silence as she opened the letter. Her lips moved as she read, her expression tender and far away. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the box. "I never knew where he hid it," she said softly. "After he passed, I searched, but I couldn't find it. He must have wanted it to stay hidden until someone cared enough to look." Her words carried a kind of peace, like a story coming full circle. The agents felt something stir inside them, a deep respect not just for her but for the life this house had witnessed. She looked up at them and smiled faintly. "I suppose it's good timing," she said. The house wanted to tell its story before it moved on. No one spoke for a while. Even the workers stood quietly, as though they understood the moment's weight. When the agents finally left that day, the sun was setting. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds, and the house stood in its glow like an old photograph. They looked back one more time before driving off. The woman stood at the window, the tin box in her hands, looking peaceful. That night, neither of them could stop thinking about her words. The house wanted to tell its story. They didn't quite understand what she meant, but something told them the story wasn't finished yet. There was still something left to discover, something that waited, quiet and patient, behind those walls. The young couple spent their first few days unpacking and getting acquainted with their new home. The woman in particular was drawn to the garden. She loved flowers, and there was so much to work with in the overgrown backyard. The husband, on the other hand, spent most of his time inside, cleaning and organizing the rooms. One evening, a week after they moved in, they sat down in the living room to eat dinner. The air outside had turned cooler, and the soft rustling of leaves could be heard through the windows. The room felt warm, cozy, the fire crackling in the hearth and the light of the lamps casting gentle shadows on the walls. They were tired, but happy, finally starting to feel like this old house was their home. As they ate, the husband glanced around the room. Something caught his eye near the bookshelf. A small door in the wall. He hadn't noticed it before. "Did you see this?" he asked his wife, pointing toward the door. She looked up from her plate and saw it too. It was just small, tucked between the bookshelves and the wall, almost invisible unless you were looking closely. A brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the light. "I didn't even know that was there," she said, a little puzzled. "What do you think it is?" "Let's find out," he said with a grin, already standing up. He walked over to the door and turned the knob. It creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow, dark hallway behind it. There were no lights back there, only shadows, and the air felt different, thicker, as if it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. "Maybe it's a closet," the woman suggested, but the hallway didn't look like it led to any closet. It stretched out longer than it should have, like a secret passage, and ended in a small wooden door. They both stood there for a moment, the faint feeling of curiosity mixing with a little bit of unease. "I don't know," the man said, stepping forward. "This is weird." They moved cautiously, the only sound the soft shuffle of their footsteps. The closer they got to the wooden door, the colder the air seemed. It was a strange, uninviting cold that made them both pause. When they reached the door, the man tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door opened with a slight squeak. Behind it was a small room, no more than 5 feet by 5 feet. The air smelled musty, like old paper and dust. At first glance, there didn't seem to be much inside, just a few boxes and old furniture covered in faded sheets. But as they looked closer, something else caught their attention. In the corner of the room, there was an old chest. It was large, made of dark wood, and it looked ancient, almost like something out of a history book. The chest had brass locks on either side and was covered in dust, as though no one had opened it in decades. "Should we open it?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He had the same feeling she did, like they were trespassing in something personal, something that had been hidden for a reason. But his curiosity won out. He kneeled beside the chest and tried the lock. It was stiff, but eventually clicked open. The lid groaned as it lifted, revealing the contents inside. At first, it was hard to make out what was in there. Old blankets and papers were piled high, but beneath them, something shiny caught the light. The man gently moved the blankets aside. What he found made his heart skip a beat. It was a small collection of objects, coins, old keys, and a tiny silver locket. And at the very bottom of the chest, there was a stack of faded letters, all tied together with a ribbon. "What is all this?" the woman asked, stepping closer. The man picked up the letters carefully. They were yellowed with age, the ink on the pages faint and blurred. He untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were hard to read. "Whoever wrote this had really small writing," he muttered, squinting at the paper. As he tried to decipher the letters, the woman picked up the locket. It was small, shaped like a heart and made of silver. She opened it gently. Inside was a tiny photograph, too small to make out clearly, but it seemed to be of a woman and a young child. "Do you think this belongs to the old woman?" she asked quietly, holding up the locket. The man nodded, his eyes still on the letter. "It's possible," he said, his voice distant. "This house has a lot of history." They spent the next hour carefully going through the chest, sorting through the letters and objects. They couldn't make sense of everything, but one thing became clear. The chest contained the remnants of a life that had been lived long ago in this very house. Finally, after reading through several more pages, the man found something that caught his attention. A letter signed with the name of the old woman. He recognized the handwriting. "This one's from her," he said. "It talks about her life, her family," he read aloud. "I remember the day my daughter left for good. The pain of it, the emptiness that came with it. I kept hoping she would come back, but she never did. I think she had a family of her own. I never saw her again. I have no one left now." He paused, glancing up at the woman who had a sad look in her eyes. "That's heartbreaking," she said softly. The man agreed. He didn't know the whole story, but it was clear that the old woman had carried a heavy burden in her heart. This chest filled with old memories was all that was left of her family, of the love and loss that had shaped her life. They spent a long time in that small hidden room, talking softly as they sifted through the old letters and objects. Eventually, they closed the chest and left it where it had been, tucked away in the dark corner of the house. But the discovery stayed with them, haunting them in a way they hadn't expected. Every time they passed the little door, Every time they walked by the bookshelf, they felt the weight of the past pressing against them. It wasn't just the house that was old, it was the memories, the lives that had unfolded within these walls, that made it feel like a living thing. A few days later, the couple invited the real estate agents over for a casual visit. They wanted to show them around and ask some questions about the history of the house. The agents agreed to come by in the afternoon, and when they arrived, they were surprised to see the couple sitting on the porch, waiting for them with cups of tea in hand. "Everything's been going well?" one of the agents asked as they shook hands. "Better than we expected," the husband replied, "but we found something strange." The couple led them inside and showed them the small door they had discovered. They explained how they had found the hidden room in the chest with all the old letters and objects. The agents listened closely, their expressions turning more serious as the couple spoke. "I don't know what to make of it," the wife said, "but it feels like there's more to this house than we realized." The agents exchanged glances. They had always known the house was special, but now they were beginning to understand just how deep the story went. One of the agents cleared his throat. "You're right," he said. "There's a lot of history here, and it seems like it's still unfolding." "Do you think it's connected to the old woman?" the husband asked. "She must have known about it, don't you think?" The agents were quiet for a moment. The truth was they didn't know. But one thing was certain. The house had secrets, and it wasn't ready to let them go just yet. As they left the house that afternoon, the agents couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. They had been part of something much bigger than just a sale. The house had lived through so much, and now it was telling its story piece by piece. And somewhere deep within its walls, there was still one final secret waiting to be discovered. The days passed, and the house settled into its new rhythm with the young couple. They were happy, or at least seemed to be. The garden flourished under the woman's careful attention, and the rooms began to take shape with their personal touches. The house, once heavy with the weight of its past, now had a new life, though it still held onto its secrets like an old friend that doesn't quite want to let go. But there was one thing the couple couldn't stop thinking about. The hidden room, the chest, the old letters, they couldn't just forget it. The woman had taken the locket and kept it on her nightstand, the tiny photograph inside never far from her thoughts. And the man kept wondering about the last letter he had read, the one that spoke of a daughter who never returned. One evening after dinner, the couple sat on the porch, their usual place for quiet reflection. The evening air was cool, the sky a deep blue fading into black. The woman rested her head on her husband's shoulder, thinking. "You know," she said softly, "I can't stop thinking about that letter." Her husband nodded. "I know, I feel the same. There's something in there, something that still doesn't sit right with me." "I don't think we've heard the whole story," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I think there's more to it. I just can't explain it." The man thought for a moment. "I agree. I think it's time we talk to the real estate agents again." They had heard the rumors about the old woman, but no one had ever really spoken to her directly about the past. The agents knew more than they had let on, but there were still gaps. The young couple had a feeling that the agents weren't telling them everything they knew. The next day, they called the agents and arranged for another visit. When the agents arrived, the couple wasted no time. "We need to know more about the old woman," the husband said. "About her family, about her past. We're not just interested in the house. We want to understand everything." The agents looked at each other, hesitant. They had been trained to be professional, to stick to the facts, but they could see the couple was serious. Finally, one of the agents, a woman with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor, spoke up. "There's more, yes, but it's not something we usually share. It's personal. We're not asking for anything too private," the wife replied. "Just the facts. We found so much already. We just want the full picture. The letters, the chest, the locket, it's all part of something, isn't it?" The agent sighed and nodded. She seemed to come to a decision. "All right," she said, "but you have to promise me something. This story it's not easy to hear, and it's not something you can change. You need to take it as it is. Can you do that?" The couple exchanged glances, then nodded. "We're ready," the husband said, his voice steady. The agent looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she began. "The old woman's name, well, you already know that. She wasn't always as isolated as she was in her later years. She used to be very close with her daughter. They were a small family, but they had a good life. The house was everything to them. But when the war started, everything changed. The agent paused, her eyes distant as though she was seeing the past in front of her. Her husband, he was a soldier, a good man, but he was sent off to fight. And when he returned, he was a different person. He was never quite the same. They tried to make things work, but it wasn't easy. The daughter, too, was affected. She was young, just a child, but she saw it all. The anger, the bitterness, the long silences between her parents. And then, the hardest part, when the daughter left for good. The woman listening, sitting beside her husband, felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but this was not it. The agent continued. The daughter, she was scared, confused. She was young, barely a teenager, and she didn't know how to handle the tension at home. Her mother didn't want her to leave, but she was too proud to ask her to stay. And the father? Well, the father couldn't say anything because he didn't know how to fix what had broken. The agent looked at the couple. The old woman's daughter left and she never came back. Not once. And the old woman never forgave herself for that. That's why you found the chest, the letters, and the locket. Those were all pieces of her heart. Pieces of what was lost when her daughter went away. She never stopped hoping for her return. The wife's eyes filled with tears. She had felt it. Felt the weight of the old woman's grief. Now she understood it more deeply than she had before. The agent went on. There were rumors, of course. People said the daughter had gotten married and moved far away, started her own family. But no one really knew for sure. And the old woman never got closure. She spent the rest of her life waiting, hoping, but never finding peace. The room grew heavy with silence. The couple didn't speak for a long time. It wasn't out of disbelief, but out of the understanding that they were standing at the edge of something too fragile, too personal to push any further. Finally, the wife spoke, her voice quiet. Did she ever get any news about her daughter? Any word? The agent shook her head. No, that's the thing. She never did. The house. The letters. The chest. It was her way of holding on to something she couldn't let go of. And when she finally had to leave, she passed it all on to the house. For a long time, the couple sat in the quiet, absorbing the weight of the story. They had been living in this house, this home with its old secrets, and now they understood why it had always felt like there was something more to it. We won't tell anyone, the husband said after a long pause. But we'll take care of it. The house, the memories, all of it. It's the least we can do. The agent smiled, a sad but understanding smile. I knew you'd say that. Not everyone would. But this house, it deserves that kind of care. And so did the old woman. The couple thanked the agent and she left soon after. The air had shifted in the house. The couple could feel it. The weight of all the years that had passed, all the love and loss that had lived inside these walls. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out into the yard where the garden bloomed in full color. Do you think she ever found peace? The wife asked, her voice soft. I think she did, the husband said, his arm around her. In her own way, she did. That night, as they lay in bed, the woman took the locket from her nightstand and held it in her hand, staring at the tiny photograph inside. She thought about the old woman's life, her choices, and the unspoken love that had been locked away for so many years. The next morning, they decided to do something for the old woman. They would search for the daughter if she was still out there. They couldn't rest knowing that the story had never been fully written. Days turned into weeks as they tried to follow the few clues they had, asking around, sending letters, even reaching out to the people who had known the family long ago. It was a long shot, but they couldn't help but hope. And then one afternoon they received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from the daughter. She had seen the house was for sale and had been trying to reach out for years, but she had been living overseas far from home. The letter was brief but filled with emotion. She apologized for leaving. She had wanted to come back, but her life had taken a different path. And she had always believed her mother had moved on, found peace. The couple read the letter together, their hearts full. They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, they felt that someone, had finally found the peace they had been searching for. That evening, the couple stood on the porch, looking at the house that had given them so much more than they expected. They had come to find a home, but what they had found was a story. A story of love, loss, and hope. A story that, in the end, was never truly over. And as the sun set behind the house, casting long shadows across the yard, they knew one thing for certain. Some houses don't just hold memories, they hold souls. And this one, the one they now called their own, was full of them,